Well, good evening. I'm Andy Chapman. I arrived in Northampton in 1976 to work as a field archaeologist with the then Northampton Development Corporation. And I spent the previous 3 years since leaving university doing much the same thing, travelling around the country, working on short-term contracts, moving from town to town. When I arrived in Northampton, I just thought it was another short-term stop. 46 years later, I'm still here, but that's another story. Tonight we're going to look at Northampton before the castle. And as Jean said, one of my interests is prehistory. So if we say before the castle, we might as well start before Northampton and look at some of that background that came before the town. So to the southwest, we have the Bry Hill Neolithic causewayed enclosure going back to nearly 4000 BC. And of course, that sits on the slopes of Hunsbury Hill with its famous Iron Age hill fort. We have Roman Duston to the west of the town, a Roman small town. But of course, they're not the only things. There's lots of other sites scattered around. So as, for instance, with the Romans, there's lots of little Roman settlements. There's even Roman pottery kilns at Delapre Abbey. And around the town is a scatter of early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, some of which came up in the 19th century during things like building the railway and quarrying. And of course, they tell us each one of those cemeteries will be attached to a small Anglo-Saxon settlement. So lots of history around Northampton. I put in this one because this is why I came to Northampton in 1976 to work at the Bry Hill Neolithic causewayed enclosure. That's our earliest earthwork site. The Neolithic settlers coming in from 4000 BC built this enclosure over 200 meters in diameter. Causewayed enclosure because the ditches aren't continuous, they're multiple breaks, they're just like elongated sausages end to end. And these sort of settlements, well, they're not settlements, we believe these sites are seasonal social gatherings. So it's places where the Neolithic people from far and wide would come and meet at these periodically. And that was excavated in the mid-1970s by NDC. And as I say, that's where I started in Northampton. More recently, we've had another slightly later site towards 3000 BC, the Middle Neolithic, excavated over at Banbury Lane in 2011 by Northamptonshire Archaeology. So we've got 3 ditches. The innermost ditch, there's a pit blocking the entrance, and that pit was packed top to bottom with articulated human bone coming from over 150 people. So there's a very interesting story there, which is obviously one we can't go into tonight, but they collected these bones somewhere else, brought them to this site to create a mausoleum for these people. So interesting things in the Neolithic going on. Of more relevance to tonight's meeting is when we come into the Bronze Age. The first excavations near St. Peter's, there's the church in blue, we're at St. Peter's Street. So there's St. Peter's Street and there's excavations either side. And the earliest thing they got was this arc of ditch. And if we project that in a circle, we potentially have it possibly be a late Neolithic henge or an early Bronze Age round barrow, about 25 meters in diameter, sitting to the immediate south of St. Peter's Church. So there is a possibility there that the placing of St. Peter's Church may have been influenced by a prehistoric burial mound that was perhaps, well, still sitting there as a visible mound at the time they arrived. So it's an interesting possibility. So briefly, there's the Hunsbury Hill Fort, and of course other smaller Iron Age settlements scattered around the town. Facing that across the river, once it became derelict, there's Roman Duston, the small town of Duston. And of course the important point of that for us in our talk tonight is Northampton doesn't have a Roman origin. So we're looking at a town that is established in the Anglo-Saxon period. Well, a brief foray into prehistory. Now we get to the core of tonight's meeting, the story of pre-Conquest Hamtun. So beginning of the 1970s, very little was known about the pre-Conquest town, largely an unknown quantity. Lots was known about the medieval town. We got documentary evidence for the royal castle, the town walls, the religious houses, and all captured here by Speed in 1610. Although it's post-medieval, it does give us this lovely snapshot of the medieval town with its walls and its castle sitting down on near St. Peter's Church, quite close to the castle. So the story starts in the 1950s when Alderman Lee proposed a model for the late Saxon town. And what he based his model on was this whole street pattern. So you got these two parallel streets cut off the southwest corner of Northampton. And so Lee's theory was that this was a fossilization of the line of the pre-conquest defences, one street inside the defences and the other street outside. And of course, the castle later plonked down on top of part of that late Saxon town. Evidence begins to appear in the 1960s. So this is a photograph of the excavations at what was left of Northampton Castle in the early 1960s next to Chalk Lane. And underneath the Bailey Bank, we have these late Saxon pits were appearing. Also, this is a drawing from the 1890s showing some of the pottery that had been found when the castle was demolished. At the time, it was all just called Roman pottery. But of course, we now know that a lot of that pottery was actually late Saxon in origin. So at the top there, that's a beheaded, that's classic Roman pottery. But these in-turn rim bowls are classic late Saxon. And here we've got some cresset lamps, these oil lamps, which have come from late 11th, early 12th century. A lot of that pottery that came up when the castle was being demolished was recognised as being late Saxon in origin. So I now sort of leap on to it. This is a snapshot of our present stage of knowledge. I should explain at this point that most of the lectures I do are built around sites that I've excavated. In this case, that isn't true. When I was running around on Bry Hill digging the Neolithic causewayed enclosure, John Williams, the head of archaeology with the Development Corporation, and also at the time Mike Shaw, one of his assistants, who arrived about the same time I did, they were the people who were working on the sites in the centre of Northampton. And Mike has recently done a PhD on medieval urban development. And as part of that, he's put together this plan of Northampton. The grey shapes show all the excavated areas. So you can see that's what we've excavated within the late Saxon town. I think he's worked out it adds up to about somewhere between 5% and 8% of the town, which doesn't seem very much, but actually nationally, that's a large percentage of a late Saxon town to have been excavated. Most places you'd be well under 5%. And of course, there we see the outline of the castle down on part of the Saxon town. Peter's Church is just in there. And one of the main things we'll be looking at is this series of excavations to the east and southeast of St. Peter's Church. So we have an aerial view from back in those early days, 1973. So there's St. Peter's Church. To the top right, the monolithic construction, that's the old Barclaycard House, as it was. The railway station still largely unchanged. We've still got the old Victorian station, and that's the massive goods shed, which is now all, of course, the station car park. And so the excavations took place all across this area, to the east of the church and down to the southeast. The little greenery up there, that's the last remaining bit of the castle. The castle came, Chalk Lane is the eastern extent of the castle. There's a little bit surviving there that was excavated in the 1960s. These buildings were removed and that was excavated. That's now the Chalk Lane car park, so there's important excavations there. 2013, I was excavating in this area before they built the new station the new station building, went in there. And my excavations on the town defences were just over in this area. So we've got a massive amount of work that's all happened in this one corner of Northampton. We'll start with a brief look at the early Saxon activity. There's not much of that left in Northampton because, of course, a lot of it's got taken away by all the later activity. But clearly, there was a small settlement here, certainly 6th, 7th centuries. And this is stolen from a nice reconstructed building. But this is the sort of thing you'd have been seeing in Northampton throughout most of the Anglo-Saxon period. Timber buildings and the characteristic Saxon construction, not horizontal timbers. You've got these vertical posts and vertical planks set between them. So these are the sort of buildings that were occupying the town up until the time of the Norman conquest. I also had to throw in as well, from the gravel quarries near Wollaston, we have the wonderful Anglo-Saxon helmet. I don't know if you can still see my image, but I'll just bring in a replica of that helmet. So that's the sort of thing that was in all the fashion for tribal leaders in the 6th, 7th centuries. So not much more to say about early Saxon Northampton. We've got some local evidence for the coming of Christianity. This is a site I did up near on the hillside below Great Houghton. They were putting in a water pipeline between Great Houghton and Brackmills Industrial Estate. So we were investigating the length of that water pipeline trench, and we came up with this small cemetery. It probably carried on beyond the trench to the north, but we seem to have a bottom end to the south. About 21 burials, all laid out west to east. We've got carbon dates in the late 7th century, and of course there's no grave goods. So we've got a Christian cemetery, and down at the southwest corner of that cemetery, we've got this very large, deep grave. The individual there was in a wooden coffin, and there's a post bit at each corner of the grave. So whoever he was, he had a timber mausoleum constructed above him as a memorial. And also, incidentally, of the men on the site, he was the tallest at 5'11". So there's always this idea that the people in the past were tiny. These were strapping Anglo-Saxon people in this cemetery. That most of the men were sort of 5'9", 5'10", and he was obviously some important character who was 5'11". So, but now we come on to, we're going to focus in on that St Peter's Church area now. Northampton Development Corporation began their excavations mainly about the mid-1970s. John Williams arrived early 70s and started this long process of discovery. And it wasn't chance. When John Williams arrived, he had a plan, and that was to look at the early history of the town in that western corner. So it was a plan to excavate what sites he could and to put together the story of the early town. So his first site was the St Peter's Street excavation. So there's St Peter's Street, and they got the chance to excavate either side of the street. And they went working their way down from the Victorian houses that are fronted onto the street, and through the medieval houses. There have been medieval stone buildings fronting onto that street as well. Down at the very bottom, there's part of a timber building there, and the important thing they came up with was three mortar mixers. And we'll be looking at those in a bit more detail later on. But if you've got pre-Conquest mortar mixers, it can only be one thing. They're building churches. The Anglo-Saxon building is all in timber, apart of course from once they start building churches, they start using stone. And these are very characteristic. You don't get them post-Conquest. They're mixing the mortar in other ways post-Conquest. So we have these. Immediately, that was an indication there was an early pre-Conquest church somewhere on the site. 3 years later, they got the chance to actually open up a small trench right next to, on the east end of St Peter's Church. And the discovery there was right up against the edge of the trench. They had a stone wall, and we'll have a look at that. So there's St Peter's Church in the background, the wire fencing. Ignore all this top stuff is medieval and later. The reddish brown is the undisturbed ground. If you look at this end, there's a little trench, stone-filled trench there. There's another one there. This balk is projecting forward. There's more stone in there. So the wall came out of there, turns through there, comes along, then goes back in. So you've got the very eastern end of a stone building at a very early date. And of course, the question then became, quite how early? 1980, they got a chance to do a larger area to the east of the church. So there's the stone wall they found a few years earlier. They've opened up a larger area, and what do they come up with? Another couple of mortar mixers, but also the western end of a very early stone building, round about the same date as that one. So we've got a stone building there, potentially the pre-Conquest version of St Peter's Church, but we've also got another early stone building heading off in this direction, and our mortar mixers around it. So things are beginning to take shape, and at that point, Dr. Williams already developed his theory, and had also published it, that there was, what we were looking at was a Saxon minster at the centre of a royal estate, question mark. So just on that initial evidence, John Williams was already confidently looking at this as a Saxon minster, and with the existence of this other stone building as well, that it was more than just one building, there was something quite substantial here. He had to wait a couple of years. So it was in 1982 that he finally got to open up this much larger area and what became known as the Palaces site. So it's 9 years after they first discovered the mortar mixers, they finally got what they were looking for. This major complex, St. Peter's Church, and next to that, in its early phase, we've got a massive timber building. And we'll have a look at that. That's a photograph taken at the time. We've got St. Peter's Church, and I'll trace around. Here's the timber slot of the timber hall. So there's the end. It runs off down there. The people are sitting or kneeling in the trench. So, and there's the other little end to it there. So this large timber hall. An issue there over what date it had been constructed. Radiocarbon dated samples, but radiocarbon dating in the 1980s was not what it is now. The dates then were coming out plus or minus 80 to 100 years. These days, you'd expect dates of plus or minus 20 to 30 years. So one of the things I've done is recently I've recalibrated those dates, because the other issue is the date you get isn't the date in real years. You have to calibrate them as well. I've recalibrated those old samples, and it still leaves a big error, but there's a cluster of dates from the late 7th to the mid-8th century. So we're looking at that timber building appearing somewhere between the late 7th and the mid-8th century, whereas John Williams in the past was saying mid-8th century. So it's certainly earlier than was previously claimed to be. And there we have a plan of it. The building 30 meters long, about 9 meters wide. You've got a main chamber with opposed doorways, opposed central doorways, and then smaller chambers at either end. The walls are built in a post slot about 1 meter deep, and you can still see the darkest soil where the posts have been. And you can see there they've emptied out the soil. There's the impression of one of the posts, and you've just got another one on the edge of the photograph there. They managed to get, for some of the building, not all of it, you can actually get the spacing of the posts from those post impressions in the slot. And there's a reconstruction, and that's a lot of timber work. So it's a massive undertaking. This big people just aren't building structures of that size in this country at the time. That is 30 meters long. It's a massive building for late 7th, early 8th century. But that wasn't the only thing. It's later superseded by a large stone hall. I never quite understood how these little rooms at the end work, but so essentially we end up with, there's our early church. We had the timber hall. Later, probably towards the end of the 8th century, it's replaced in stone. And that's where all our mortar mixers are coming in. They're mixing the mortar for building the church and for this massive stone hall. There's some views of the stone hall. The west wall, closest to St. Peter's Church, survived quite well. There's the slot, there's the construction trench for the north wall. And you can see there, it's well, empty. So that wall had been more or less systematically dismantled and the stone carted away, probably after the Norman conquest. The south wall was actually probably originally much better, but of course you've got all these holes. You could have seen on the previous photograph, it's pitted with all these circular, sometimes rectangular holes, which are all the pits and wells of the medieval period. Of course, while your interest is to get down to these early levels, once you get there, of course, there's not that much left. All that later activity through the medieval period has holes in it all. So it's a matter of piecing together these fragments that remain between all the pits and wells and other structures. You can see at the top there, there's a brick-lined well from the post-medieval period. All that later activity has done a lot of damage to the site, but there's still enough left to reconstruct the plan of that stone hall. We've got the walls about 1.2 meter wide, foundations are 0.6 meters deep. It's built in limestone and ironstone. And within the walls, they were getting pieces of Roman ceramic tile. There's also tufa, which the Romans were using in their bathhouses as insulation. The indication is, of course, that the stone wasn't coming from stone quarries. Why would there be stone quarries? They don't build in stone. So they're going along probably to Roman Duston or some other Roman ruin, Roman villa. And they're carting away the stone from those Roman walls because, of course, it's the Romans left. Nobody's been building in stone. So all the way up to and beyond the Norman conquest, you have to picture a British English landscape in which there's still ruins of Roman buildings were still standing 500 years later. So you should cover the Anglo-Saxon landscape of Britain with derelict Roman buildings. And of course, once you start building churches, of course, as most famously at Brixworth, where they use the Roman tiles in the arches, the most convenient way to get stone in the Anglo-Saxon period was to go to one of those Roman buildings and quarry it. So that was the major discovery in the archaeology of Northampton. The Saxon palaces, the timber and stone palaces, really put Northampton on the national archaeological map. That's a cover from the popular magazine Current Archaeology, which is still running today. And just briefly, we'll have a look at the mortar mixers. There's a reconstruction drawing showing how they're operating. You've got a central post, horizontal beam, and well, either men or you perhaps could have harnessed animals to it. And basically, you're rotating that beam with its paddles attached to mix the mortar for those stone buildings. So here we see there's there's one mortar mixer there. There's a mortar mixer there, a very large one, and they've actually reduced the size later, so you've got a smaller mortar mixer inside a larger mortar mixer. These are all medieval, there's stone-lined wells and other features cutting through it. There's a nicely preserved one where you've got the mortar had been left, the remnants of mortar have been left in situ. You can see little holes around the edge where it was lined with wattlework. Post socket in the centre for that upright post. And in at least one example, they found a couple of voids here where the paddles have been left, the mortar had been left to set around the paddles and the beam. So indicating the presence of paddles beyond at least two large paddles set between the central post and the edge of the pit. And there, if you go around the country, these mortar mixers since then a lot more have appeared. At the time, the best parallel for it was at Monk Wearmouth in County Durham, which of course Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow, the famous monastic sites. And since then, more have turned up elsewhere. If you've got a pre-Conquest Minster site, there will be mortar mixers somewhere. I think the most any other sites had is 2. So Northampton with its 5 is still leading the way for the quantity of mortar mixers. And just a little reconstruction drawing there, showing the mortar mixers in use as they're building an early stone church of St. Peter. We've been talking about St. Peter's Church and the timber hall and the stone hall. You may have, those of you observant, may have noticed some of the plans I put up there. St. Peter's, there's the stone hall, and there's something that says site of St. Gregory's Church. So we have to look at the church, the one that's missing. So there are records, there are medieval records of the church here of St. Gregory. There's records of Norman art, so it looks like it was probably rebuilt after the conquest. In the 16th century, it was converted into a school, and later it got absorbed into a 19th century factory. And I think absorbed is the right sense because some of the church walls were actually used within in the factory. So parts of the stone walls they built brick walls onto them. So even right through this 19th century factory, some of the stone walls are certainly the school buildings were still incorporated into that 19th century factory. And of course, the dedication is to St. Gregory the Great, who was Pope in the late 6th, early 7th century. And so again, the late 7th to mid 8th century is a sort of date that fits in with our dating for the radiocarbon dating. So dedication to St. Gregory fits in with the dating we were getting from that timber building, and it's all beginning. We've got a minster complex that starts late 7th, somewhere between the late 7th to mid 8th centuries. Oops, I'll just nip back briefly and point out. There's the site of St. Gregory's. There's Gregory Street. In that corner there was excavations in the 1980s. One of the later excavations carried out by the Development Corporation right alongside Gregory Street. Most of what they got were post holes and pits of the late Saxon period. But right up at this end of the site, right next to Gregory Street, they had to extend the trench almost under the pavement to get to them. There's 3 graves. And of course, Gregory's Church is up to the north. So we've got 3 graves here, which have been all radiocarbon dated to the pre-conquest period. With that excavation, they'd found the southern end of the cemetery that went with that pre-Conquest church of St Gregory's. And on this excavation, it is round 90 degrees. They're right along this edge of the site, those burials. At this point, I'll put in a little statement. The site of St Gregory's Church is currently derelict, overgrown, partly under a car park. It is the site that's of vital importance to understand the early history of the town. We've got that picture. We know about St Peter's. We've got the palaces site with its timber and stone halls. St Gregory's Church is the third part of that huge minster complex that really lies at the foundation of the town of Northampton. So if that site is ever going to be developed, it must be fully excavated before any development is allowed to go ahead. So hopefully one day there'll be an opportunity to find that other church. So we'll have St Peter's, we'll have the timber hall, the stone hall, and we'll have the other church. Hopefully there'll be some remnants of the Saxon church, and certainly parts of its cemetery should survive. And part of this was looked at by John Blair of Oxford University in the 1960s. He was looking at the person to go to about the pre-Conquest church. He's written a very good book about it. So he was looking at Northampton, and he's looking at this. John Williams had very much gone for the argument that it's a palace, it's a secular palace with associated churches. John Blair takes a rather different view, that it's actually a minster complex, and that the hall is part of the minster complex. But again, even if it's a minster complex, it still has to have that secular backing. Northampton at that time is part of the powerful kingdom of Mercia. You wouldn't have a major minster complex like this unless you've got that secular power supporting you and financing you to a considerable extent. And John Blair's put together some comparisons here. Of course, here we have Augustine's at Canterbury with churches in a row. Here's Northampton with all to the same scale with St Peter's, St Gregory, and the hall between. And there's the stone hall. Oops, I made the mistake of jumping on. And here at Frankfurt, you've got a palace and the palace chapel. So these are the sort of things that are being seen right across right across contemporary Europe at the time, both in Anglo-Saxon England and onto the continent. And of course, as John Blair points out, on these complexes, you've got the main church has a apostolic dedication here to St Peter, and St Gregory's you have the lesser church, the secondary church, which often be to Mary, but in this case to St Gregory. We don't have a huge amount of finds. Of course, this site was levelled before the conquest, and it's had 1,000 years of occupation since then. So there's not a great deal in the way of finds surviving from that period. There is this rather nice interlaced mount that comes from an Irish shrine, and the town has produced one of those off the site near St Peter's and one from elsewhere in the town. We have a couple of writing styli, which is not much when some of the other sites, say Flixborough and so on, have produced a lot more in the way, but then they don't have the level of disturbance that we have in Northampton from all the later activity. But it's a sort of thing, yes, you'd expect to see. It proves we have literate people in Northampton in the 8th century. So not in huge quantity. We'll now skip over the next bit. So of course, it's one thing you're writing archaeology and not history. So it's often difficult to tie archaeology to history. But of course, by the late 9th century, we know the town's become a centre for the Danish army. Mercia, the kingdom of Mercia, is being pushed back. The incoming Danes are pushing Mercia back. But in the early 10th century, we have the Danish army submits to Edward the Elder of Wessex, son of Alfred. We've had the period with the rise of the Danes. They pushed Mercia back. Mercia was the major kingdom of England in the through to the 8th century. They're pushed back by the Danes. They decline in importance. And of course, it's Alfred and his sons and Wessex who become the dominant force in the later Saxon period. So from the early 10th century, we have the submission of the Danes to Edward the Elder. And of course, Edward then goes on to the reconquest of the rest of Eastern England, the Danelaw. And of course, then he moves north. Eventually, England becomes a nation effectively under Edward the Elder, and certainly under Athelstan. We have a thing called England appearing. So a much bigger story than we're dealing with tonight, but Northampton has its little part to play in that with them. So we've got rid of the Danes, we have the Reconquest. So the thing we're looking at now, of course, unfortunately, our Minster complex has gone, although St. Peter's Church, of course, was to rise again, but even St. Gregory's still survived as a church right through to the medieval period. One of the crucial things, of course, is hunt for the defences. One of the other things John Williams was hoping for when he started his work in the 1970s was to find a length of the town defences. So that was a long-term objective. He never managed it with the Development Corporation. And I was the fortunate person who in 1990, the winter, it was about a week before Christmas in 1995, the days when we actually had snow before Christmas sometimes, I was sent in to put in a trench into this site. There's the West Bridge, Black Lion Hill. St. Peter's has disappeared under the photograph, and of course this is the station. So this is going to become the castle at a later point. So we didn't muck around. We had a big site to play with, so we just put in the longest trench we could across the diagonal of the site. So we put in a 43-metre trench, and we knew we might have to go down to quite some depth. So we made it nice and wide, if necessary, as you can see, safety reasons, so you can step the trench in. You don't want a trench several metres deep with a vertical edge. So we made it nice and wide so we could step in. Looking to the west in the distance, you can see we found the ditches. We found a major ditch here. We stopped being that when we hit water level. All this dark soil in the fort, this is post-medieval levels. There we're down onto medieval levels, and poking up through the medieval levels, you can see that browner soil. That's the top of the late Saxon bank, and there it's got a medieval stone wall on top of it. So after everybody else, I was the person who got lucky and found the town defences. So I'll just go back briefly. We found the defences in that large trench. I also put in a couple of smaller trenches to the southeast, and we picked it up again. So that's why we've actually established the length of the defences from there to there. Although, of course, it won't survive from there to there. It would have been disturbed by later buildings, but we can say certainly that's the surviving length of the defences there. We've got the line right, and I got a full sequence of development. So if we start at the bottom, A is the buried soil underneath. So that's produced mid-Saxon pottery and a carbon date of the 10th century. With the soil underneath, that's more or less contemporary with the Minster complex at St. Peter's. On top of that, we've got a clay bank. And of course, in front, they've dug a ditch right down into the lias clays. They've thrown out that clay to form a bank. And along the front of the bank, if I go up to the plan here, they've dug a trench along the front of the bank, and there's post holes at interval. So there's a big timber revetment. So they've heaped up the clay behind a timber revetment with a ditch in front of it. So that's our first stage of defence, and we date it to the 10th century. It's possible that it could have been constructed by the Danes, but I favour it being a construction after that reconquest of the town. I would believe it's a construction after Edward the Elder and the reconquest of the Danelaw, and they're trying to establish burhs. Wessex has used this. The way you hold territories, you establish fortified towns, the burhs, and those act as your core defence in an area, and then you move out from there, pacifying the territory. And that they were using the same technique in East Anglia, so I would argue those defences probably appear 920s onwards under Edward the Elder. So we have our clay bank with a timber revetment. At some stage, they take the timbers away and they put in a wall in limestone along the front. So they replace a timber revetment with a stone wall. And later still, around in the 12th century, they put an ironstone wall on top, and that wall there, that'll be about contemporary with the construction of the castle. So you've got a lovely section. If you take the section through, down at the bottom, this is our buried soil. That slightly greyer soil, that's the timber slot for the timber revetment. The other thing they'd done, after they removed those timbers and put in a stone wall, they'd removed part of the bank and they put a roadway through the gap. So we have road was largely limestone. The white stones there are the road. Then later on, that's our medieval wall put on top of them. So we go timber revetment, we've got the stone wall with the gateway, and then we've got our medieval wall. So it's a complete sequence of defences. I've stolen this one from Oxford, where, as you can see, the defences look very similar at Oxford. We've got our clay bank, you've got a big timber revetment in front, and at some later stage they put in a stone wall. So it's the same sort of sequence of development. It's just that at some stage, probably in the 11th century, either we can't tell whether that's pre-conquest or post-conquest, take out part of the bank, they put a road through, they put a stone wall in here, the front of the walls had all been lost. And we've got a series of post pits here, which may have been, perhaps there was a timber gatehouse flanking that road. So that was a surprise that we have a gateway in the 11th century. And then later on, they fill that in with clay and build a medieval wall over the top. So for a period of about 100 years or so, we actually have a gateway through the defences. And here I am, I'm looking along the line of that gateway. And what do we see in the distance? We've got St. Peter's Church. And in that on the map, of course, we've got St. Peter's Street, we've got Green Street. So at some stage in the 11th century, you could have walked along St. Peter's Street, carried on down Green Street, you would have come to a gateway through the defences. But of course, our West Bridge is just a little way to the north. So quite, is this a Boston Gate, or did they actually relocate the West Bridge for a period of 100 years? It's something we can't give an answer to. But interesting. So town planning in the 10th, 11th centuries. It's not Saxon town, as I said there. We're more or less talking about a large village with defences. A very loose arrangement. There's houses scattered around, lots of open space between the houses and workshops. The idea of developed street frontages, houses on the frontages, comes much later in the medieval period, post-conquest. So you wouldn't, standing inside it, you wouldn't recognise much difference between 11th century Hamtun and a Saxon village, except that, of course, it's just that bit bigger. And of course, you'd come to and it would be surrounded by its defences. The houses themselves are come up. This is the Chalk Lane site, which is actually was buried underneath the castle bank. And here you've got, you can see there's a pit there with a post at each corner. So you've got a sunken cellar. There's big post pits here for timbers. There's more post pits up there. So we seem to have a sunken timber-lined cellar underneath a building, possibly represented by those 6 posts. There's another sunken structure there. There's another one of these sunken houses up there. So there's also scatters of post holes, which sometimes you can make them into buildings. A lot of the times you just can't, because there's just not enough left to be certain of what was going on. And there's a number of these structures have come up in Northampton. This is excavations at Woolmonger Street in the 1990s. So we've got another one of these big sunken cellars, and here you've actually got the wall of a timber building as well. So we've got the timber building. You've got a cellar under part of an elongated timber building. There's another one there that came up in the Seoul Central site underneath the old Berkeley Card House. So we've got little snippets of timber buildings here and there around the town. A lot of finds that come up in that period. We've got a whole range of pottery, the cooking pots and the bowls. These are from the Thetford area. These are storage jars. We've got these big, heavy thumbed supports on them to help strengthen the pots, and big loop handles. So these are sort of things that have been strapped on the back of a pony to transport goods around the country. And of course, bone. Bone was the plastic of the plastic, really. Right throughout history, of course, if you want to make combs, you've got pins, a whole range. These are actually spindle whorls. So a whole range of objects would be made out of bone. From the sites at Chalk Lane, there's also evidence for copper, iron, and silver working. So you've got to picture our late Saxon town of Northampton with all its timber framed and thatched houses, but you've got craftsmen there, you've got people working, people actually manufacturing these objects, and we've got people who are doing copper, iron, and silver working in the town as well. And of course, those craftsmen are going to come to a place like Northampton because it's a trading centre and it offers security. with town walls. You've got a more secure life. And by the middle of the 10th century, they're also minting coins in the town of Hamtun. And there's an interesting story behind those as well, because coins were turning up with Hamtun on, and for a long time it was assumed they were coming from Southampton. And it was only one coin specialist who did the obvious thing. He took all the coins of Hamtun and was plotting out their distribution around the country. And of course, what he came up with was some Hamtun coins were appearing in the south, and other Hamtun coins were appearing mainly in the Midlands. So he managed to distinguish between Northampton and Southampton. So we can now identify which coins were locally being minted in the 10th century. So, well, we've gone through briefly what we know about late Saxon Northampton. We're back to our plan by Mike Shaw, showing. So we've been looking at these sites. There's Chalk Lane with its timber houses and its craftsmen working in copper and silver. That's literally underneath the castle bank. These are the 1960s excavations. So those Saxon pits that were being found in the 1960s were coming up there. We've had a look at these are all the sites. There's our Timber Hall. And of course, St. Peter's Church. Woolmonger Street is there. And of course, that's Seoul Central. We've also got Saxon houses. Seoul Central was the huge lost opportunity there. The whole of Buckley Card House was being demolished. Trial trenching was carried out underneath, and it turned out that there was a lot of intact archaeology surviving under Berkeley Card House, which was a bit of a surprise. But unfortunately, the developer for Seoul Central didn't really like the idea of paying for lots of archaeology. So most of the Seoul Central site got buried underneath Seoul Central, hopefully preserved. And they were just, some of these excavations, they were able to excavate bits like the lift shafts and so on. So in ideal circumstances, we could have had a whole block of the late Saxon, well, the pre-Saxon, the late Saxon, and the medieval town could have been excavated in one go. It would have cost a lot of money, but of course that would have become the most important site in the town's archaeological history. As it was, well, much of it is left buried. Possibly, when they come round to developing next time round, there might be a chance to complete the job, depending on what survives. So, well, the castle makes its first appearance. So we just come on to the final excavation. And again, I've jumped ahead when I should have been pointing out on the map. My final excavation before retirement was this site here in the corner of the outer bailey of Northampton Castle. And as you see, if you project the line of the Saxon defences, we're outside the line of the defences. And actually, we're on quite low-lying ground near the contemporary river, as you'll see in a minute. So I've got a little site that's inside the outer bailey of the castle, but outside the defences of the Saxon town. I'm not going to talk about the castle today, but underneath the castle deposits, what we got a fair bit of Saxon. The nice straight edge to our excavation, that's the wall at the front of the old Victorian station. So they set that quite deep in the ground, but we've got some late Saxon ditches of the 11th century heading down, and the ground drops away quite steeply, and all the soils in here were mixed up silts and clearly been deposited under, well, at least seasonally wet conditions. So from this point onwards, we're on to essentially the river floodplain. But we've got boundary ditches curving down, dropping into that. We've got a nice cluster of late Saxon pits here. But then on this side, we've got these nice straight boundaries. Now, while those produced, in fact, there's a nice well there, was carbon dated to the 10th century, but most of the pottery is 11th century off this site. So we've got a boundary ditch that was in use through the 11th century. These boundary ditches, this nice rectangular system comes in a bit later. And not only is it 11th century, some of the pottery there is 12th century. So it looks like we've got a late Saxon boundary ditch. We've got a nice rectilinear boundaries that seem most probably post-conquest in date. But the pottery goes through to the 12th century, and we'll return to that in a minute. A range of finds from that site. We've got a little cast copper alloy brooch, one of the first things we found. We didn't find anything like it again. It is actually tiny. It's only about 15 millimeters in diameter, so less than an inch in diameter. Tiny little brooch being cast in copper. Interesting thing we've got here is a set of iron shackles. So there's the shackle to go around a foot, and we've got chains attached to it. We'll find out what is possibly used for in a minute. And also from these 12th century ditches, we've got some of these oil lamps. You can see the burnt round the top. You'd have oil in there and a wick, and you see the scorching around the top of the oil lamps, just like the ones that they found in the 19th century. So the big thing we got from that site was lots of animal bone. So that's all the bone laid out on the table at the office. But what we've got from looking at that animal bone, most of it's not domestic waste. It's not, some of it's food waste, but the vast majority of it is clearly butchery waste. So on this wet ground down by the river, close to the West Bridge, we've essentially got a riverside dumping ground. So the local butcher is dumping all the waste bones on the site. There's also bits of craft waste. This is a bone skate. You can see the highly polished surface there that would have formed the rudder for the skate. These are common finds on late Saxon towns around the country. And we've got about 5 of them, most of them incomplete. So clearly, for whatever reason, they decided they weren't enough, and so they went in. They were dumped down by the riverside along with all the butcher's waste. We've even got bones from a badger, which probably most likely we've got a local badger who's scavenging around all this butchery waste that's being dumped there, close to the Western River crossing. Of course, so it might be that our shackles were not used on people. They may have been a set of shackles that were being used for animals that were being brought in for slaughter at the butchers. And just as a little taster for the upcoming lecture on Northampton Castle, just look at that pottery again. So this photograph, if you go to the Northampton station and look at the big panel they've put in, there's a big display panel talking about the castle and the railway stations on the ground floor. That's the photograph that appears on that panel, and it shows my team there. And we had to wear National Rail safety wear. So that's full orange and white helmets. You have to have white helmets because if you had red or green, they could be mistaken for signals. Even though we weren't actually on the railway line, we were on Network Rail property, we had to wear the same equipment as if we were actually on a railway line. That's why we're in the full orange suits and white helmet. And I lost my point there. So yes, they're excavating, my team are excavating one of those Saxon pits. And the pottery we were getting from the ditches, those post-conquest ditches are over in the background and coming along to the right. It goes all the way through to this period, dated by Paul Blinkhorn, no doubt, no less, through the period 1100 to 1150. And so what we can say is that this area wasn't buried, it didn't disappear under the castle until sometime after 1100. So at least the outer bailey of the castle is a construction in that period, and I would suggest most probably we're talking about construction of the outer bailey during the reign of Henry I. So it's an addition to his royal castle, perhaps somewhere around the 1120s. So what that implies for the rest of the castle is a subject we might pick up in the next lecture of who built the castle and when. And I've just about come to the end there. I have my advert to finish off with. What I'm busy doing at the moment is editing and partly writing reports for our forthcoming journal. So hopefully to be released later this year when I finish writing it, by Northamptonshire Archaeological Society. And normally we publish a journal that's full of reports from all over the county on periods. This one is going to be a special, focusing just on the archaeology of medieval Northampton. John Williams, former head of the Northampton Development Corporation, has written the article on the pre-Conquest town. Mike Shaw has made contributions to that, and I've added in a little bit on the carbon dating of the timber hall. I'll be writing about Northampton Castle, which will be partly writing up those excavations. Well, there'll be a report on the excavations of the 1960s. It can't be a full report because we haven't got, the records weren't very good and we haven't got all the finds, but there'll be a report on the excavations of the 1960s set in the context of the castle as it's been recorded by all the way from Henry Dryden in the 19th century onwards, and with those wonderful photographs that were taken, well, wonderful in the sense that we have them when the castle was being demolished. From Marcus Roberts, we've also got a report on the medieval Jurian synagogue and others. So we'll be publishing that later this year. It'll be one of the biggest statements on the medieval archaeology of the town that's been published. And what I'm using there for the background to the cover, that's part of the east wall of St. Peter's Church. Gates were locked at the time. The one bit I could do was go down and poke my camera through the railings. So St. Peter's Church is the background to the cover. So yep, I think I've reached the end of my lecture, and that's the story of Northampton before the castle.